Just check your phones for volume control, and then we will go ahead and get started with our meeting. We're going to hear from the Department of Natural Resources today and a lot of the different branches of the department. So we'll hear their presentations, and at the very end, we'll open for questions. And I know this is the time of year where most of us are running to an appropriations meeting or another meeting, so just let the viewing audience realize that. And our deputy commissioner today is going to begin. You want to just sit up at the table and bring the people up as you need it. And see if I think I have your mic on for you. Go see if is it on? Okay. Go ahead and introduce yourself to the committee, and then it's your show, but go through and then we'll ask the questions. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Walter Rabin. I'm the Deputy Commissioner for the Department of Natural Resources. Celebrated that anniversary this week, so I've been in seat for about a year. Before I get started, let me say it's great to be here this morning in front of a committee that knows already so much about our agency. We were talking about it beforehand that we could swap seats with you, and most of you could come out here and tell us about our agency, and that's a kudos to you for spending time and getting engaged with our personnel throughout the year and not just during the 40 days that you find yourselves trapped in Atlanta. I got a couple of people that I want to introduce that you are probably familiar with that you will not hear from this morning. First is Mary Catherine Yerta. She's our Director of Public Affairs and Legislative Governmental Affairs. And we have Amber Carter, who is our Public Affairs Assistant. Like I said, most of you probably see both of them on a regular basis. I'm just going to be very brief and give you a quick overview of the agency as a whole. We do have 5 divisions within our side of the house, as we call it, in DNR. EPD, while it is a division of DNR, most of you are very familiar with Judd and his side of the shop. But on our side of the shop, 5 divisions. Our mission is to sustain, enhance, protect, and conserve Georgia's natural, historic, and cultural resources for our present and future generations, while recognizing the importance of promoting the development of commerce and industry that utilize sound environmental practices. So that can be a balancing act from time to time to try to get that accomplished. We have 1,544 employees. About 581 of those today are part-time employees. Have an overall budget of $130 million. $67 million of that is in state funds. $20.5 million are federal funds. Each of you should have a folder in front of you that's got a lot of additional information. It also has our contact numbers for myself, everyone within our staff here in Atlanta. So don't hesitate to call us. As we transition into a little division update, I'm swapping gears. I'm going to turn into Director Woodward, who most of you know. On a personal basis, I understand that you visited the coast and spent some time with Spud and really got a good education on what our Coastal Resources Division does for all of our constituents on the coast. Spud got a pass from driving from the coast this morning. So like I said, I'll do a very inadequate job, but I'll give you some highlights of what Spud and his team do on the coast. Probably one of the biggest functions that they have is managing Georgia's saltwater and recreational and commercial fisheries. Saltwater fishing in our state makes up $500 million of economic impact, which is huge to our economy in our state. We have about 250,000 saltwater fishermen on our small 100 miles of coastline. CRD also administers our Georgia Coastal Management Program, which consists of federal funding and state funding. We provide assistance to 11 coastal Georgia counties. We assist with monitoring water quality at our beaches, monitoring coastal marshland plants, and we distribute about $1 million in coastal incentive grants annually for research projects and public access improvements. The Coastal Resources Division is also vital to our marine resource inventory and monitoring. We facilitate large and small trawls samples to as many as 9 estuaries along our coast. Last year, we took water samples from 82 shellfish sites to ensure that the oyster hatchery, the oyster fishery that we enjoy, meets the public standards for safe consumption. And then CRD also works as a regulatory agency with our law enforcement division to resolve any unauthorized activities along our coast. We've got about 14 barrier islands. 4 of those have roads to them. The other 10 do not. So we've got 100 miles of beaches and a third of the salt marsh on the eastern coast. So you can see that Spud and his team, they've always done an outstanding job for us, but they stay extremely busy along that coast. With that, let me introduce, and let me digress. Commissioner Williams sends his regrets for not being here today. We have a wildlife biologist that's receiving a national award today in Nashville, Tennessee, from the National Wild Turkey Federation. So Commissioner Williams was able to go up and be with him today as he gets that honor. Along with that, Director Dan Forrester of the Wildlife Resources Division is also up there with his biologist. But today we have Assistant Director Mark Whitney, who will come up and tell you a little bit about Wildlife Resources Division.
Good morning, Madam Chair and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to be in front of y'all today. And Dan does pass along his regrets for not being able to be here, but it's a happy occasion. We often are recognized for the science that we conduct relative to wildlife, and this is just one example of that. Bobby Bond is receiving a national award. May interest you to know that that national award is also named after one of our former employees. He was Chief of Game Management within the Wildlife Resources Division for a number of years before his untimely death. That was Joe Kurz. So it is Joe Kurz Management Excellence Award by the National Wild Turkey Federation. I do represent Wildlife Resources Division. It is my pleasure. I came up through the division and love it, love what we do. But we conserve, enhance, promote the fish and wildlife resource and outdoor heritage that's associated with that. We're really about science, and we do that through science-driven management and regulations. The way we're organized, we have 3 sections. You're probably very familiar with all of them, but we have a fisheries management section that does exactly that, takes care of the resource that's in the freshwater of our state, and does some shared responsibility with Spud and his team, in fact. We also have a game management section that is responsible for those species animals that are hunted and trapped, and the proper management of those, as well as managing the land base that's been entrusted to the Wildlife Resources Division. A little over 400,000 acres in state ownership, but about 1 million acres in total in our wildlife management area system. And then we have our non-game conservation section, and they take care of the other 95% of the animals out there that aren't trapped or hunted or fished for. And they are probably our smallest section, but have responsibility for most of the species, and in addition to that are the ones that take care of the endangered, threatened, and rare species that we have in the state. As y'all are already aware, wildlife is defined as a public trust resource, meaning that it belongs to the citizens of Georgia. It's our responsibility in statute to manage that resource with the best science available. So we're the science people associated with the management of the resource, at least the terrestrial and freshwater fisheries part of it. And how do we really do that management? Well, I mentioned the public lands management. We take continuous research and survey data on those species, harvest information related to how many deer or how many turkeys or whatnot that are being taken annually, plug those into models that we've either developed or have been developed by other scientists, and come up with recommendations to the board for the regulations that are set for hunting and fishing, as well as determining what are the best techniques and employing those techniques on the land base to manage the forests and the streams and the fields that wildlife inhabits. Probably every one of y'all is familiar with at least one issue that's come up before you related to either fish or wildlife. But some of the challenges that are inherent that really come with trying to deal with that public trust resource so that all the interests are accommodated as well as possible. As a public trust resource, the state owns it, but there's always interest in the privatization of wildlife for a number of reasons, either pets, breeding stock, or confined hunting operations. I think all of you can probably put a finger on one of those issues that's come before you. The importation of certain species of wildlife that may bring inherent either parasites or diseases associated with it that could be either a public health or a native wildlife issue. And then, of course, we're struggling with collecting sufficient data all the time on these species. In particular, in 2010, there was a petition to list on the federal threatened and endangered species list about 122 species that are in Georgia. And many of those is just we don't know enough about them, so we are scrambling to try to pull enough information together on many of them in order to keep those off the list, because that could have impacts to either private landowners who own the land base that those species exist on, or certainly development projects and anything that involves federal dollars. And then, of course, I think on every issue you always have two sides to the story, and very rarely do you find one where everybody is on one side of that story. So opposing constituent concerns and needs and wants for each one of those species, we also struggle with that and try to bring before you for consideration some of the best recommendations we can as we try to apply science as well as social science to some of these issues. But really, why is it important? Proper management, sustainable wildlife. Truth is, it's important because it contributes to the quality of all of our lives. It also contributes pretty heavily to the economic health of our state. I'm just going to give you a few numbers, and I would call your attention to the fact sheet for Wildlife Resources Division when you have an opportunity to look through that, because there's a lot of numbers in there. But right now, there's almost 1.5 million Georgians who fish. Quite a bit more actually than 500,000 Georgians hunt, and we have almost 2.5 million who enjoy wildlife viewing and watching, whether that's photography or hiking, just to go listen to a Bob White sing or whatever it may be. But the total annual economic impact associated with all of that outdoor recreation that surrounds wildlife in this year is about $5.6 billion. It accounts for more than 39,000 jobs in the state of Georgia. So we are a going concern. It's not all about the animals, but it is about the people here in Georgia. And then I'll just leave you with a little bit of information about how we are funded. And I want to do that because I think yourselves and everybody should pat ourselves on the back for what a good deal Wildlife Resources Division is for the citizens of the state of Georgia. We are funded really in three different pots of money. One of those are the state appropriations, which 80% of is brought to us by hunters and anglers who buy licenses every year. So hunters and anglers are footing the bill on the majority of the state dollars that come back to us annually through appropriations, and we appreciate that. In addition to that, the biggest pot of money we have is a federal pot associated with an excise tax, a federal excise tax on ammunition, on firearms, on fishing equipment and archery equipment, self-imposed tax by sportsmen and by manufacturers that goes into a pot at the federal level. And then we reclaim our part by being able to count the number of paid licenses that are bought by anglers and hunters in Georgia to reclaim our share of that pot. So you hear us talk about certification and want to bump up those numbers. That's why. There's a pot of money put on the table every year outside of any kind of appropriations process at the federal level, and we want to reclaim as much of that as we can. But in order to do that, we have to sell a license. We can't give one away. But the federal funds make up about 45 to 50% of our budget annually, and then we have another pot that we call other funds, and those are things like, and thank this body for certainly being involved and helping, but things like our wildlife license tags that come back to us to fund our non-game program. Some of the timber that we sell on those state lands in order to do habitat management does come back to us in order to be able to manage them well. And then we get a number of grants from foundations and others in order to help us manage wildlife and manage the environment around them. With that, I just want to say thank you for your time, and I'll leave you with those words. So thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Yep.
Dr. David Crass, come up from our Historic Preservation Division.
Morning, everyone. Madam Chair, appreciate the opportunity. We promote the preservation and use, and that word use is very important, of historic resources or places for a better Georgia. HPD consists of 27 employees, including myself. We have about a $3.2 million budget, almost evenly divided between federal and state monies. There are 6 program areas that I'd like to talk about briefly with you today. They cover about 90% of what our division does. And the first of these is the National Register of Historic Places. Many of you have probably heard about the National Register. It's what I call a gateway program. Virtually everything else that we do in our division intersects in one way or another with the National Register. The National Register is just a list of the most important historic places in the state that are worthy of preservation. Getting listed is a pretty arduous process. There's a lot of research and writing involved by the sponsor of the nomination, and then that's vetted by us, and then by a state outside advisory board that we host, and then finally the nomination goes to Washington for the National Park Service to consider. We're considered a national leader in National Register nominations. We have a very, very high success rate with the National Park Service. Currently there are over 2,000 National Register listings in Georgia, comprising over 80,000 historic properties. So many of these are districts in our historic downtowns. One thing that I'd like to note with regard to National Register listings, there's a common misperception out there that getting your property listed in some way impinges on a property owner's rights. That is emphatically not the case. Listing is simply a stamp of approval by our office and the National Park Service saying, yes, this place is historically important and worthy of preservation. The second program area I'd like to talk about, we refer to as our environmental review program, and I'd like to focus on something specifically that's called the Section 106 review process. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, federal agencies like the Corps of Engineers and HUD were going into the states and carrying out big, big federal projects. Think of those horrible low-income housing towers that HUD used to put up in the middle of our historic downtowns. And so the U.S. Conference of Mayors got very agitated about this. They lobbied Congress hard for several years, worked with Lady Bird Johnson, the First Lady at the time, to get something called the National Historic Preservation Act passed. And that act set up what's called the National Historic Preservation Program. So throughout the country, every state has an office like ours, a state historic preservation office. The Section 106 review process that I referenced mandates that federal agencies that are doing business in the state of Georgia have to come to our office if their actions are going to possibly impact historic resources. A good example of this is the Savannah Harbor Deepening. That's a project I've been involved with for about 17 years now. Some of you may have heard of CSS Georgia, essentially an armored artillery battery that was anchored out in the middle of the river, and she then was scuttled at the end of the war and was perched on the edge of the shipping channel. Very important historic resource. So as part of that Section 106 process that I referenced, the Army Corps of Engineers had to recover the major parts of that vessel. She's now out in Texas being conserved, and then will come back to Savannah to become part of the historic tourism trade downtown there. We are acutely aware that the Section 106 process is very closely tied to economic development. For instance, we review all of DOT's road projects. So all told, we review about 2,000 separate projects a year. I'm very proud of our staff. We conduct a very vigorous review, but it's also very, very efficient. I would stack our turnaround time up against any other state office in the country. The third program area I'd like to talk about for a moment is our tax incentive program for the rehabilitation of historic buildings. There are actually three components to this. There's a federal component which awards a tax credit for income-producing properties. And then we have state tracks as well, two of them. A property tax abatement program that holds the property tax rate at the pre-rehabilitation rate for about 8 years, and then it gradually rises after rehabilitation. And a state income tax credit program as well. Currently, our poster child for this program is Ponce City Market. Most of you are probably familiar with it, the old Sears Southeast Distribution Center on West Ponce de Leon. About a $330 million project that our office was intimately involved with, and in fact the developers have said on more than one occasion publicly that had it not been for our office and the tax programs that we administer, it would not have been a successful project. And all you have to do is drive down North Avenue now and see the impact that that's having on the revitalization of the old Fourth Ward. In fiscal 15, I haven't got the 16 figures compiled yet, about $15 million in tax credits. This is at the state level now, not the federal. Leveraged about $330 million in private investment and generated about $500 million in salary and wages. The fourth area I'd like to talk about is our archaeology program. We have a small but very, very talented staff of archaeologists in our office, and they really focus on two things. One is assistance to local communities. We get an awful lot of phone calls, particularly about cemetery issues. And then we also work closely with universities and colleges in the state to make sure that our department stays in compliance with federal and state codes regarding archaeological sites and burials. Two of the most important ongoing projects that we have right now. One is a partnership with the University of Georgia. They're carrying out a field school every summer on Ossabaw Island, one of the islands that our agency manages. And that yields great management data for us and also gives those graduate students coming out of UGA's program a terrific hands-on experience. And then some of you may have heard of Camp Lawton, a Confederate POW camp that was discovered by our folks working with the Georgia Southern University staff about 6 years ago. And that Confederate POW camp is located at Magnolia Springs State Park. So that's a good example of how staying in compliance with state and federal codes helps us manage those one-of-a-kind resources. The fifth area I'd like to talk about is our African American Historic Preservation Network. I'm proud that Georgia was the first state office in the country to devote resources specifically to the African American community. It's a very, very small portion of our budget, about one staff person, an intern, and some operating money, but it's been a great instrument for us to bootstrap local projects. A good example is on St. Simon's Island. Harrington School was the sort of proverbial one-room schoolhouse. It was built back around the turn of the last century. Generations of African American kids from the local community went through there, and then it was shuttered in the 1970s. About a decade ago, the local folks came to us and asked for our assistance in helping develop a historic preservation plan for that building and help them sort of figure out how to get that rehabilitation underway. And so I'm proud to say that we're about 6 months out from reopening the school as a community activity center. The county really stepped up to the plate and acquired the property itself, and it's going to be passive use green space. So that's a good example of how we bootstrap that type of project. The final program area I'll mention briefly is what we broadly refer to as our Community Assistance Program. And here I want to focus on something called Certified Local Governments, or CLGs. This is a joint program between local jurisdictions, our office, and the National Park Service. In order to become a CLG, a local jurisdiction has to pass a preservation ordinance, impanel a commission to administer that ordinance, and then designate at least one local historic preservation district. We're considered a national leader in the CLG program. There are 92 currently in the state, and we usually get a few more each year. It's a pretty arduous process to become a CLG, but it yields three benefits. One of those is access to a small pot of federal pass-through grants that we administer. and another is enhanced technical assistance from the National Park Service. But the most important benefit that CLG status gives a local community is it gives local citizens an additional tool that they can use to help control the development of their historic downtowns. So if you want examples of good, very vital CLGs, Madison, just east of town here an hour or so, Thomasville, Augusta, Savannah, Columbus, Macon, these are all certified local governments with whom we work quite closely. And I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kraft. Becky Kelly. Becky is the director of our Parks, Recreation, and Historic Sites Division.
Good morning, Chairman and Committee. Very good to be with you. Our Georgia State Parks are nationally recognized as one of the best in the nation. So I know that you're all very proud. Many of you have parks in your jurisdictions and you know about us. In your folder is a fact sheet that gives us a little bit of information about us and our brand new brochure, which is just hot off the press. But for those that I haven't had a chance to meet, I am Becky Kelly, and am very fortunate to be able to lead our division as our charge is to protect our natural and cultural resources and find ways for our guests to have fun, get healthy, and enjoy their outdoor experiences. We do this through 64 state parks and historic sites. We have a number of partners that we work with in the management of these sites, notably the North Georgia Mountain Authority, who assist us with our lodge operations, and we've been able to really improve those assets over the years thanks to your bond funding of some capital investments there. Those facilities are becoming fresh and new and exciting and in introducing new people to our outdoor recreation assets and all across our state. We have been focusing on the last few years on two critical things: trying to become more sustainable so that our impact on the budget is minimized. I'm very glad to say that about a third of our budget is achieved through state appropriation, and we generate the balance of our funding through revenue that we generate on our own. One of the things that we've found over the last few years is that the more opportunities we provide our citizens to get out and to get active, the more visitation we see. So the last few years we've seen our visitation grow substantially. We've seen our revenue capacity grow, and we're finding new ways to introduce our people, our citizens, and our guests. Many people traveling through our state we like to snag and keep at our state parks and historic sites. One of the things that we have been focusing on, because we did a survey just this last year of what types of things people really like to do in our state, and of course camping is a #1 experience, so we focus on providing both urban and primitive types of camping. We've introduced new ways for people to get in the woods, but you can sleep on a bed or on a cot. We can provide anything in between. But we're also encouraging people to find out about our historic sites, because we learned that many people come to our state wanting to understand our culture. And working with our wildlife resources and our historic preservation division, we're bringing those assets to our public in a way that they can enjoy them and appreciate them. And when they come, they're coming to your communities, and they're spending money in your communities. And when we look at the economic impact of our state parks and about the 8 million people who come and visit us, that's over $600 million worth of impact in our state, and about 6,000 jobs that are generated from our existence. And again, most of that is realized at the public level. So we understand that we have an important connection to our host communities. The fact sheet that is in your folder will give you a lot of information about our organization and what our goals are, but I would just call to your attention that this year is our 85th anniversary, and we're very proud that we are continuing our legacy of being one of the best systems in the nation. And we certainly do appreciate your support as we continue to find ways to improve our operations and provide our citizens with the best quality service that we can. So thank you for the opportunity to be with you this morning. Yes, ma'am.
Last but not least, We've got Lieutenant Colonel Jeff Weaver with us. Colonel Eddie Henderson is also headed to Nashville. He's got an officer that's being recognized for his work in turkey enforcement as well. But we've got Lieutenant Colonel Weaver with us.
Good morning. Thank you, Deputy Commissioner. Good morning, Madam Chair, committee members. Glad to be with you this morning to talk about the Law Enforcement Division. Also, let me take just a second and introduce a colleague, Major Stephen Adams, runs the Special Operations shop in our division. A little bit of history first. Becky just mentioned 85 for parks. Well, game wardens just turned 105. We were created in 1911 by the Georgia General Assembly, and so we've been serving Georgians since 1911, so we're proud of that. And the first game wardens were assigned in extreme southwest Georgia. Of course, quail was king back then. There wasn't a lot of game animals to be had, but certainly the quail was prevalent, and actually our first badge had an etching of a quail on it, so that's pretty neat. Now, I mentioned game warden. I'll go back and forth between game warden and ranger. We call ourselves kind of a term of endearment, game wardens. If you grew up in rural Georgia, everybody called us the game warden. Well, now our technical name is conservation ranger, and I'll explain that a little more in just a second. But our mission has been basically the same over those 105 years. We focus on public safety and protecting our precious, awesome natural resources. Being a game warden or being a ranger is not just a 9-to-5 job, but it's a 24/7, 365 lifestyle. We're on call, we respond, we want to be that go-to person in the community. So certainly we do our duties with pride, commitment, dedication for our Georgia citizens. You heard Mark Whitney mention there's approximately 1.5 million licensed anglers, 630,000 licensed hunters. We have 330 some odd thousand registered boats in the state. So that's a lot of recreation, a lot of folks chasing fins, furs, and feathers. That's good because we're all about the wise use. Conservation, in layman's terms, is just the wise use of the natural resources. So that's what we're about. Our core mission, as I just touched on, we're tasked by statute to enforce hunting, fishing, boating, environmental laws, commercial-related fishing and shellfish industry along Georgia's coast, and obviously we support the other 4 divisions of our department. Because of our unique equipment and response capabilities, we're well trained in the woods and water scenarios. We have the equipment to access those areas. So we consider ourselves the most versatile peace officers in Georgia. We are well trained in woodland and waterborne operations, aviation, critical incident reconstruction, woods and water search and rescue. This happens almost daily. Disaster response, and canine law enforcement. We've had a canine unit for about probably going on 12 to 15 years. So in other words, what we rangers consider this to be is law enforcement off the pavement. So basically, when the pavement ends, our duties begins most times. Because our officers are so versatile, we assist federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies in a variety of activities. This includes our participation with the state of Georgia's Counterterrorism Task Force, Body Recovery Team, Governor's Drug Task Force for marijuana eradication, and Child Abduction Response Team. We participate as members in all those important duties. In addition to patrols on private lands and waterways, rangers provide public safety, as I mentioned, to other parts of the division. So we provide public safety on all DNR controlled properties, which includes 102 wildlife management areas, 10 public fishing areas, and 63 parks and historic sites. So the state of Georgia is roughly 37 million acres. We cover that from top to bottom, from Dade County to Seminole, from Camden to Rabun, and all things in between. Our rangers are on the ground. That also includes 16,000 miles of rivers, 500,000 acres of impounded waterways, Of course, we've got the coastal Georgia, 100 linear miles of shoreline, and we go out to 200 miles offshore. In addition to all these duties, we are very integrated in the community and teach hunter and boater education. So these rangers, they have quite a workload, and we expect our officers to be a part of the community. We want to be the face of the agency, be in the community, and be well known on a first name basis. I hear a lot of legislators and city and county officials say, when they're talking about an issue with a ranger, they say, well, my game warden or my ranger. That's great. That's what we want to hear. Currently, we have 182 post-certified positions. These men and women are, stationed all over the state. We are actually allocated for 212 positions, but as I said, currently we have 182 boots on the ground. 47 of our counties, of the 159 counties, is without a resident ranger. As I mentioned, we want that ranger a part of the community, so we do have some holes, and we want to eventually, we're poised and ready to fill those when the time comes. But it does create a few extended response times from time to time with those gaps. In your packets, you've got a copy of our strategic goals, which list our 3 overarching goals as a division. Obviously, conservation law enforcement is our #1 overarching goal. Education, outreach, and community involvement. And we do put emphasis on training our officers and recruitment and retention of those officers. Also, you have an annual report and a division fact sheet. So it is our goal that we continue to provide the citizens and visitors with exceptional services through the wise, allocated use of our resources, which y'all have entrusted to our department. You heard mention of a national award winner, and I know this committee is very familiar with, we had 2 national award winners in our division. This past year, I want to brag a little bit on these 2 guys. We had 2 officers. Greg Wade, he's a corporal out of our Albany office, was selected for the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies Conservation Law Enforcement Officer of the Year. So that's a national award. Greg was one of the best of the best. Jason Robertson, corporal on Lake Lanier, out of our Gainesville office, was selected as the National Association of Boating Law Administrators Boating Officer of the Year. So we're very proud of those accomplishments, and I know this committee, a lot of you have co-signed on a resolution to recognize those 2 officers, and we certainly appreciate that. Some of you have been out with our officers on patrol, and we appreciate that. You see firsthand some of the issues we face, but offer that out to all the rest of the committee. If you want to get out and ride with our rangers, the game wardens, let us know. I will certainly make that happen. And that's all I have. If there's any questions.
Thank you very much. And I think we have about 10 minutes left, Deputy Commissioner Rabin. So do we want to start with your division and see if our committee has any questions for you?
Absolutely. Thank you.
I see no questions. So you have impressed. All right, press your button so I can get 27. Okay. State your name and then ask your question.
Timothy Barr. You mentioned you have some availability for some openings and y'all are ready to fill those. Knowing how few officers there are, can you just briefly tell us how you train officers? Do y'all have a school? What does that look like?
Good question. When we do hire an officer off the street, they become post-certified. That is a 10-week process. Then after that, we have a specialty training session that we do internally, and that's 14 weeks. So that takes place, those rangers graduate, then they go into a field training program, and that's another 6 months. So basically, when we hire an officer, they have a full year of training before they're really turned loose and on their own out in the field. So good question. We pride ourselves, it's probably the most extensive training of any state officer, and we pride ourselves on that because, These officers are in a lot of remote areas by themselves and face a lot of unique situations that we certainly want to have them trained for.
Thank you.
Thank you, and want again commend y'all for what you do. I through the years have heard of some very sad situations that a ranger has been in, and our committee, we're very lucky to have what y'all do for our state. How is your retention of your rangers? Is that good?
You know, in years overall, pretty good. Used to, my generation, if you became an officer, you know, you worked your whole career doing that. But now we do see officers from time to time leaving for other higher paid metro agencies, for instance. And then retirements. You know, we've realized a lot of retirements in the last couple of 3 years. We haven't been able to keep up with that, losing those officers.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
Does our committee have any questions for Historic Preservation Division? David Crass. Just press your button so I can see. Okay, number 21, state your name.
Dr. Crass, Representative Buddy Harden. I don't have a question, but I do just want to say that Dr. Crass has been very responsive to several requests I've had on historic preservation, and I very much appreciate the way that department is run. In fact, the whole DNR department I just have to give a shout out to, because y'all all do a great job. But Dr. Crass, I appreciate you very much.
Very kind words. I appreciate that.
Thank you. And stay put, there's one more question, I think. Number 25.
Representative Robert did. Thank you. I got a question that was asked me this morning, so I don't know if it concerns DNR responsibility or not, but historical markers that are put around our state for various reasons, is that part of your responsibility division?
Years ago, it was administered by the department through the Parks Division, actually, but it has now been handed off to the Georgia Historical Society in Savannah.
Okay.
Yeah, so they're responsible for both erecting new ones and maintaining the existing ones.
Well, I'll pass that along to Representative Rhodes then.
Thank you. And another thing that happens, just to add to trying to get the historic markers back in place, a lot of times road construction means that they take them down, and then the contractor never puts it back up, and that's part of their job as contractors to do that. So that's when our legislators pretty much get the calls, and now we know y'all will direct us to the right place. Number 12. Go ahead, just state your name, ask your question.
Yeah. Question. Heard you talking about recently discovered finds and things. Up in Decula, I know they are looking at Fort Daniel. You know, they thought they'd found the site, and now they're finding they found an earlier fort that was probably up there. And now how do y'all get involved? Is it up to the county to buy that land to try to preserve that, or do y'all go in to declare where money is available? How do we, because those are very special to us up there, that especially the first Peachtree Street and the Continental Divide and everything up there, yeah.
Yeah, our division would get involved with technical assistance, and in fact, in prior years, I'm going to think back, must have been about 6 years or so ago maybe, we were assisting the archaeologist a little bit with that
study,
with that project, exactly. We do not have funding, but we can certainly help them find grantors for acquisition.
But y'all would declare it, whatever, the state would declare the site, whatever.
Probably the best route to take with that would be for us to have a conversation about National Register listing, because that would make it eligible for certain grants from the Park Service.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, sir. And then Director Kelly, do we have any questions for Game Fish and Parks Committee? Normally, we have a separate committee in the House for Game, Fish, and Parks, and then on the Senate side, the Natural Resources Division is all combined under one committee. So we kind of have we have 180 members versus 56, which pretty much explains the math and why that's done. But no questions. That means everybody's going to be pulling you aside. So get ready for for the questions. Okay, and then. And Mark Whitney, do you, for our Wildlife Resources Division, any questions there? We have one, so sir, if you'll come up, we'll get to that. While you're getting up here, go ahead and identify yourself.
Representative Buddy Harden, and I'm wondering, I think that you said 80%, I believe, of your income come from license fees.
The state dollars that are appropriated back to us.
Right, yeah.
A minimum of 80% of that is hunting and fishing license
And brought in,
fees.
okay.
Yes, sir.
And I know that there is a bill to increase those fees, and I assume that, I think sportsmen are in favor of it, and I assume the department is also.
Until yesterday, there was a bill that was in committee, sir, but my understanding is that bill has been pulled at this point.
Okay. All right, thank you very much. And I guess one thing you said was you don't give free licenses, but basically you do lifetime licenses for older people, such as some of the group here.
Looks like a pretty young crowd, but what we do not receive are the federal dollars or credit for a license if we give a free privilege. In fact, Georgia, among states across the nation, appears to give away more free privileges than any other state. And that has impacted our ability to capture federal funds. And some of the talk that was related to the bill that you mentioned was about certifications and some creative ways we had come up to be able to capture a few more of those folks.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions. So thank you, sir. And then we're back to our Deputy Commissioner. Raven, do you want to say anything about the coast or say anything else to us?
Just hope no one has any questions for Spud.
We need to go see him. If we have questions, just go to the coast, right, y'all?
Exactly. I'll just say that we have some awesome natural resources in our state, and you can see that we've got some great facilities around our state. We've got some neat toys that we use to manage these resources. As Lieutenant Colonel Weaver said, we encourage you to get involved with your local DNR staff. And with all of those facilities and all those neat toys, let me just say that the strength of our agencies and our personnel, and we're very proud of what each of them do. So thank you for your support, not only in this 40 days, but every day throughout the year in your communities.
We have a lot to brag about in Georgia. I do see one question for you, number 11.
Yes, Representative Abel Mabel Thomas, Atlanta, Fulton. I got something in the mail about a conference that's going on in coastal Georgia from February 18th to the 20th. Is that something y'all are sponsoring?
I bet that we are involved in it.
Okay.
Dr. Davis?
Yes, go ahead and answer.
Yes, I believe that is sponsored by the Ossabaw Islands Foundation. Georgia Southern is involved as well.
Coastal natural,
Yeah, they've got a terrific line of speakers. If I can get some contact information from you, I can. Oh, you said you got something.
Yeah, I got something in the mail.
Okay.
I just wanted to know it was
That's what it is.
okay.
Thank you. And I want to point out one other thing, that a few years ago we passed a 501c3 to create the department, what do we call
Natural Resource Foundation.
Natural Resource Foundation. And if you watch Georgia Outdoors or any of the other series on television, that fund is part of that. So as individuals, we are free to be able to contribute to that, as well as anybody in our state or anywhere who wants to do that. We're trying to ratchet up the profile of what our natural resources are in Georgia and how great they are. And then the Friends of the State Park is a phenomenal group. So it's not just the state funds that make our parks great, it's the individual citizens and people who want to support them. And so I know we always welcome that support as well. Thank you. We will stand adjourned. Just be on the lookout for any announcements. They'll be posted on the bulletin board outside, or you'll get notices. Thank you.